Perfect. Okay, great. Thanks for coming today, and I'm going to give you an overview of kind of Aquatic Reserves Program, some of the sites, what citizen stewardship committees are doing on the sites. So I skipped a little bit. I'm going to skip over some of the sites a little bit that we don't have active citizen stewardship committees for. So aquatic reserves are designated for a 90-year term. They're created to promote preservation, restoration, and enhancement of state-owned aquatic lands. So we don't purchase lands to create aquatic reserves. They are designated from existing state-owned aquatic lands. However, if a land trust or some entity, a private entity, wants to donate property, we can include that in aquatic reserve, and that has happened several times. The three kinds of reserves, all reserves are environmental reserves, but they can also be designated as educational or scientific reserves. And we have 8 current reserves. I'm going to go through those, but you can see them. They're all pretty easy to see except for Lake Kapowsin down in the far right-hand corner is our newest reserve. But I'll go through all of them so that you can see what they are and what's going on. So Cherry Point, we're going to hear more about Cherry Point in detail, so I'm just going to say it was one of our first reserves established, and the biggest recent news is that the Gateway Pacific terminal that was going to be the coal terminal is now part of the reserve. So the pier that extended out from this middle section, that there was a cutout for that potential pier, and that's now part of the reserve. So that was a big process we went through a couple of years ago to expand our reserve boundary and include that former cutout back into the reserve. And the other big thing is the decline of the Cherry Point herring, and our program has been contributing to research to try to understand why that decline is happening. And yes?
Is there any update on it? I've been hearing it for many years on Cherry Point herring. What's the latest on it?
Well, so the returns have been very low and declining. So each of the last couple of years has been the lowest number coming back. And the other sort of striking thing is that they used to spawn at a number of sites throughout the reserve, and now they're only spawning in the northern part of Birch Bay. And there might be a little bit of spawning on the reserve, but it's not enough that Department of Fish and Wildlife has been able to detect it. So Eleanor, are you talking about that at all in your presentation? Okay. And then, of course, active citizen stewardship supports this reserve, and most of you are here. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that because I think that Eleanor will probably be talking about that. And so, for instance, there's these events like What's the Point here, and citizen monitoring work like intertidal and bird surveys, which Eleanor will talk about. Right? Okay. So one reserve we don't have a citizen stewardship committee for is Cypress Island. It's basically because there's almost no one on the island because it's a natural area, and it's surrounded by an aquatic reserve. But there are some cool things happening at Cypress Island. There's a pinto abalone restoration project, and they outplanted them in several sites, and a couple of them are doing really well. So that's really exciting. And we do ecological monitoring there, and the Natural Areas Program has been doing restoration around the island. Secret Harbor is their really big project. Yes?
You want us to ask questions as we go along?
Sure, that's fine.
I'm just curious, the pinto abalone, do we have a hatchery? I'm not real familiar.
Oh, so the Puget Sound Restoration Fund, and I believe Department of Fish and Wildlife is involved as well. They do have a hatchery, and it used to be at Mukilteo. I think they've moved it. But yeah, they're growing them to different sizes, and they've been testing different methods, like do they put out juvenile, do they put out little whatever the little seedlings are, or, so they've tried different levels of outplanting, and yeah. There's a lot online about Pinot abalone restoration that you can look up. So this pocket estuary restoration at Secret Harbor is also a site where we're monitoring for green crab. And because these kind of little spots are where green crab love to get established, invasive green crab. So yeah, I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail. If you have questions about any of these specific projects, we could talk about them at the end or offline, when we're done here. So kind of moving south, Fidalgo Bay. It's one of the smaller marine reserves, but it has a lot going on. It's got some huge eelgrass beds. It's got one of the most successful Olympia oyster reintroduction projects, led by the Skagit MRC, again, Puget Sound Restoration Fund, and Paul Donnell. So there's a lot of information on that project, and also some follow-up kind of like master's thesis work done by one of our former Puget Sound Corps. She studied oyster larvae in the water column, so a really interesting project she worked on there. Also, so the Citizen Stewardship Committee does a lot of forage fish egg sampling, because there's huge sand lance use of Fidalgo Bay. And so we pretty much have everywhere that they're spawning mapped out around Fidalgo Bay. It's an amazing amount of spawn. So the Citizen Stewardship Committee is very engaged there, and they're involved in a bunch of different monitoring projects and helping put on Fidalgo Bay Day, which is their one big event, kind of like the Cherry Point, What's the Point? This is their big event. And they do a lot of community education, like going out and doing talks to different groups in the community and working with high school students and middle school students and teaching them intertidal monitoring and forage fish monitoring. So Smith and Minor Islands is arguably our most ecologically important reserve. It's the largest reserve, and it has a lot of, about Smith and Minor is the largest, the biggest, the bestest, like the largest persistent bull kelp bed in Washington. So bull kelp is annual, but it persists at this site in a very large aerial coverage, which makes it super critical habitat. And there's a lot of important seabird foraging habitat, because there's these large shallow banks within the reserve that have lots of intertidal tidal vegetation. So it's a really cool site. And so this is an example of kind of one of those bull kelp beds mixed with another species. And the Citizen Stewardship Committee is not active right now at Smith and Minor, but we did do a lot of good projects while we had folks engaged, and developed this welcome sign at Libby Beach, which is where we do the kelp research and where there's a lot of harvest. And there's also a kiosk there, so if you're on Whidbey and you want to check it out, it's just like 2 miles off the highway out to the west, and the Libby Beach Road is marked, and you can map it. So you can go down there and check this out, and you can walk the beach from this county park. So Protection Island, it's located just between Sequim and Anacortes, and kind of touches the shoreline of those peninsulas, the Miller and Quimper peninsulas. It's got similar habitats to Smith and Minor, also including some similar features like these gigantic feeder bluffs, similar to Whidbey, also are on these peninsulas. And there's a lot of natural shoreline along the shorelines with associated just amazing habitats. So the Citizen Stewardship Committee they're much newer. They just got started more recently, and their big project is to do bird surveys from a boat. So they've been doing marine bird surveys and going out and doing a kind of a big triangular loop within the reserve around Protection Island. It's also got a lot of kelp, but more diverse kelp communities than bull kelp communities. And there's an interesting story around Protection that it used to have huge bull kelp beds, and they've kind of disappeared. But they've been replaced by more diverse kinds of kelp. So, you know, with an annual species like bull kelp, there is potential for it to drop out and other species to come in and replace it. So here's a feeder bluff in action, and there are tufted puffins and rhinoceros auklets that nest on Protection. There's some of the species they look for in the bird survey, among many others. And this lady is one of the volunteers. She's also the photographer of many of their great images for Protection Island. So Maury Island is one of the earlier reserves. It had kind of a interesting, controversial establishment where it was designated by our then Commissioner Belcher primarily to prevent a huge gravel mine from happening, because they could not give it authorization to use state-owned aquatic lands to put in a giant pier. So the origins of it were controversial, and I don't even know the entire story of the politics of the establishment of this reserve, but it was many to equal Cherry Point almost. I don't know if there is any equal to Cherry Point, but it's up there. And so there were residents there for and against and all that kind of thing, but it did ultimately become established. And King County has done an amazing job of protecting shorelines and purchasing key shoreline habitats and restoring them. So the lighter colored green areas are King County natural areas, which include the old gravel mine sites and a number of other sites around the islands that they've been working on pulling out bulkheads and doing restoration. So
What's a long drift? What are long drift?
long drift cells. So I don't really have a pointer. Okay, all right. So a feeder bluff is any large erodible cliff that is feeding the beach with sediment. So where I showed you on the last slides of that big landslide coming off Protection Island, that's kind of a feeder bluff in action. That's sediment flowing down the side of a bluff to the beach. And if that's cut off by bulkheads or other armoring, it reduces that flow of sediment. Now, a drift cell is what happens when that hits the beach. And so this is one of the longest drift cells in Puget Sound. And these are really high bluffs all along this. So where that's interrupted, so a drift cell is where there's a flow along shore of sediment. So the tides, currents, and whatever forces make that sediment all move in one direction. And in many places, there'll be a point or there's some other projection sticking out where the drift cell ends or starts going the other way. But in this one, there's this long drift all along Maury Island. So that makes it important because it's a natural process that is, just critical for a healthy beach. So I'm sorry, I'm not like a geomorphologist. I can't give you the more. But oftentimes people interrupt these by putting groins out there and trying to stop them and doing all kinds of interference to, cut down that flow of sediment. And the sediment's really important for all the species that use the shoreline. So that's why we're interested in maintaining drift cells and the natural processes like the bluffs and things that feed them. Again, there's some really great and much more scientific information about all of that online, and I could probably point you to those if you're interested. So we have a newer Citizen Stewardship Committee that Vashon Nature Center is the sponsor for. And the other two that I talked about were both Fidalgo Bay and Cherry Point are sponsored by Resources. Vashon Nature Center and Vashon Land Trust support the Maury Island CSC. And their big summer event is the low tide celebration at Point Robinson, where there's a lighthouse and there's tide pools. And they've been doing this a long time. They've been doing this since before the reserve was even established. So this is a long-running event where they have really detailed beach naturalist instructions on how to work with people and, you know, better beach etiquette. And they've really done a great job of figuring out how to share the low tide with folks and not have it get completely, you know, destroyed at the same time. So it's a really cool event. At Nisqually Reach, its big ecological claim to fame is being connected to the National Wildlife Refuge. So there's a lot of, each builds upon each other, and protection of the whole Nisqually watershed, you know, helps increase the ecological importance of this site. So it's got some of the largest eelgrass flats in South Puget Sound, and it's important habitat for the Chinook and other salmon coming out of the Nisqually River. The site proponent was the Nisqually Reach Nature Center, and they have a building and they have a lot of volunteers, so they're kind of the core support for this reserve. And some of the things they are doing, so here, this is a Pigeon Guillemette training session. This is looking at forage fish eggs and microscopes. This is a summer camp on Anderson Island, and the Nature Center sponsors a lot of educational activities every summer for kids, so lots of stuff going on there. So the Citizen Stewardship Committee is variously involved in all these different things. And then we've been doing things like developing signs and posting signs and interpretive signs, that kind of thing. Lake Kapowsin is not a marine reserve. It's our newest reserve, only a few years old, and it's a freshwater lake in southeast Pierce County. And there, the community has really joined us to get this site going and clean up the shoreline and create better shoreline access. We had our first celebration there, which was Lake Kapowsin Day this summer, and it was really fun. And you know, we didn't have a huge crowd. We had enough people that were interested that came. That was really exciting, and so it's really great to kind of initiate a reserve and build the community around it. It's been really fun. It's a great place to go canoeing and kayaking. So basically, reserves work when there's stewardship and community happening around them. It's a lot harder to do without that. We've had support from a National Estuary Program grant that's helped support our citizen stewardship committees and their sponsors. That grant is ending in December. I got it extended a couple times, but this is like this is the end. So we're working on trying to develop more grant funding, and one of the ideas I have that I would want to pursue is either starting a foundation or getting under the umbrella of a foundation for all our nonprofit partners to help apply for grants that DNR can't apply for ourselves, and to bring money in to support volunteers and events and monitoring, that kind of thing. And some of the other things I didn't mention before that aren't like out there doing things is we've done a lot of products and education and outreach things to connect to public, and a lot of online work with both DNR's website and aquaticreserves.org. So one of the issues we've understand is that a lot of people don't know that aquatic reserves exist. So that's one of our big pushes, is to, keep trying to work on that and keep getting the reserves out there so that people know what they are. We did a process of strategic planning last year, and one of the things that came out of our program, kind of our internal discussion, was that we really want to support science on the reserves. That includes citizen science. These are some of the projects that we're involved in or that our partners are leading. And this is a short list. It's not all of them, but there's many more. But we're interested in working with universities, high schools, graduate students, to support and really build our research program for the reserves. That's one reason why they're there. So we want to make stronger relationships with those folks who are interested in doing that, and also help teach people to do that. A lot of projects have actually happened that we didn't even know about. And we realize that's because we're not out there connecting with researchers, letting them know that we want to know what research they're doing. And we'd really like to get their data, too, if they're doing it on a reserve. So just a little point I wanted to make. One thing we've been doing is trying to get all the data that we have access to represented online in the data viewer, and Jamie Kilgo has done a good job of this. So this is Cherry Point, for instance. The diamond shape at Birch Bay, that's an aquatic reserve seagrass net monitoring site at Birch Bay. And then the stars or the sea star, that's a sea star, is intertidal monitoring, and the birds are for the bird survey. And I think if you're on the data viewer and you click those, and you can get more detailed information for those projects. So this is pretty new, but I think, yeah, and then this is an example for Nisqually Reach. This is the forage fish data at Nisqually Reach. So it's just, depending on what layer you click on, you see different images. And that's all I have. Gone a couple minutes over, but I think we have plenty of time for questions. So if we have any more questions after that.
Hello. Can I have everybody that asks questions use the microphone just so we can make sure to hear you on the video recording when we put it up online?
So you asked about the Cherry Point herring, and I think it was, I forget, it might have been an implementation meeting that we heard the latest on the Cherry Point surveys that I think Fish and Wildlife conduct. And ironically, there are virtually no cherry herring at Cherry Point. There are, as a matter of fact, the hotspots. The hotspot for Cherry Point stock is right off of Birch Point, if you know where that is, north side of Birch Bay. And some activity in Drayton Harbor, and a little bit south, quite a bit south of the reserve. So that's kind of what's happening with the Cherry Point stock at this point. And I have a question about the island reserves. Is there much pressure as far as development? Are the islands part of the reserves?
Okay, so Smith and Minor and Protection Island are part of our National Wildlife Refuge. And so they're surrounded by the reserve, but they're not part of the reserve. They're managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife.
So we have a sneak preview of a video that was recently made about Cherry Point Aquatic Reserves. We are going to go ahead and show that now. There's a little bit of editing still to do, so if you see any mistakes, feel free to let me know. They're probably in there. So we're going to do that, and if you want to take this time to grab a cup of coffee or a snack, they now exist. They are in the room. So feel free to do that at this time as well.